The first lightning strike hit so close it felt like the mountain itself flinched. The air cracked open with a sound so sharp it stole my breath, and before I knew it, my buddy Ryan and I were crouched low on the ridge, staring at each other with wide eyes. We'd been hiking along the crest of Blue Hollow Ridge all afternoon, chasing the last bit of sunlight before camp. The storm had rolled in from nowhere, a grey fist closing around the peaks, faster than we could react. I remember the smell of ozone, metallic and electric, and the way my trekking poles hummed faintly in my hands before I dropped them. That's when I realised we were in trouble. We were at nearly 10,000 feet, with no cover, but a few scrub pines clinging to the rock. The trail stretched out ahead like a narrow spine, both sides falling away into steep valleys. To the west, sheets of rain marched across the range, swallowing everything in their path. Ryan shouted something, but the thunder rolled over his words. Lightning forked across the sky so bright it left ghost lines in my vision. My heart thudded as I scanned for any dip or hollow where we could ride this out, but all I saw was exposed stone. The wind came next, cold and biting, howling up from the basin. I dropped to one knee to steady myself, pulling my rain jacket tight. Ryan pointed toward a notch in the ridge about 50 yards ahead, where the trail dipped between two boulders. It wasn't much, but it was lower than where we stood. We moved fast, crouched low, packs bouncing against our backs. Every few steps, another flash split the sky, followed by a blast that made the rocks tremble beneath our boots. By the time we reached the notch, the rain had arrived. It came in sideways, needling our faces and soaking through layers in seconds. We pressed against the leeward side of a boulder, trying to make ourselves small. The storm was right on top of us now. The hair on my arms stood on end, and I could taste the metal tang of static in the air. Ryan's eyes met mine, and we both knew what that meant. Lightning was hunting close. "We can't stay here," I yelled. He nodded, pointing down the ridge, where the slope dropped toward a cluster of darker shapes, maybe trees. It would be dangerous, slick as glass in the rain, but better than being the tallest thing on the ridge. We hesitated only a heartbeat before moving, half running, half sliding down the incline, boots scraping rock, rain blinding us. Behind us, thunder roared like an avalanche. We didn't talk much. Every breath was a cloud of steam, every sound muffled by the relentless storm. The mountain felt alive, angry, pulsing with light and noise. I remember thinking how small we were, two specks scrambling through chaos, hoping the next flash wouldn't find us. And as the ridge finally began to level and the hint of forest came into view, I dared to believe we might just make it before nightfall. The slope turned treacherous as we descended, slick granite coated with mud, every step a gamble. The storm was in full fury now, lightning strobes flashing through the sheets of rain like a camera gone mad. We were soaked to the bone, our packs heavy with water, boots squelching with every step. The thunder was no longer a sound, but a living thing, a constant growl that rattled through my chest. Somewhere behind us, I heard the crack of a tree splintering, a dull crash swallowed by wind. The smell of ozone was so strong it burned my nose. Ryan slipped first. 1 second he was ahead, the next his boots went out from under him and he was sliding down the slope on his side, scraping past a jut of rock. I threw myself forward and caught a strap on his pack before he went any farther. The jolt nearly yanked me off balance, but I dug in, the soles of my boots grinding against wet stone. "You good?" I shouted. He nodded, pale-faced, rain dripping from his chin. We both knew the ridge wasn't going to forgive a second mistake like that. We angled toward the darker mass below, a patch of stunted spruce trees clinging to the mountain's shoulder. It wasn't perfect shelter, but it was lower ground, and that was what mattered. The problem was getting there, without turning into lightning rods. We moved fast, leaving our trekking poles behind, packs still on to absorb the hits if we fell. The rain eased for a brief moment, and I could see our goal clearly, a shallow hollow behind the trees, littered with granite slabs. The promise of even a few feet of cover gave me new energy. We made it to the tree line just as the storm found us again. A blinding white flash hit somewhere nearby, so close the world went silent for half a breath before the concussion hit, flattening the branches around us. I felt it in my teeth. The ground vibrated like a drum. Ryan cursed, gripping the bark of a tree for balance. "We can't stay under the trees," I yelled over the roar. He nodded and pointed toward a break in the roots where the mountain seemed to cave slightly inward. A narrow crevice, maybe a few feet deep, barely enough for 2 people. But it was our only choice. We threw ourselves into it, backs against cold stone, water rushing past our boots. It wasn't dry, but it was better than open air. I pulled my rain cover tight around my pack and crouched low, trying to make myself as small as possible. Lightning continued to dance across the ridge above, flashes outlining the trees like silver bones. Time blurred. Minutes, maybe hours of sitting there, shivering, counting the seconds between flash and thunder. At some point, the worst of it passed. The thunder softened, retreating to the east, leaving only the sound of wind and dripping rain. I leaned my head back against the rock, muscles trembling from adrenaline. Ryan let out a shaky laugh, half relief, half disbelief. "Next time," he said, "we check the sky before climbing a ridge." I managed a weak grin. "Next time," I said, "we camp in the valley." The storm had humbled us, stripped away the illusion of control, and left only raw gratitude for each other and for the mountain that decided, just barely, to let us live another night. When the thunder finally rumbled away into the distance, the silence it left behind felt heavier than the storm itself. The rain hadn't stopped completely, it just fell softer now, a steady whisper against the stone. My hands were shaking from the cold and the shock of it all. Ryan and I sat in that shallow crevice, breathing hard, every muscle sore from the tension of holding still for so long. The air smelled of wet pine and iron, and steam rose from the rocks around us as the temperature began to drop. Twilight was creeping down from the peaks, that blue-grey hour when the world feels both alive and eerily still. We took stock of what we had. Our packs were soaked through, but the waterproof bags inside had done their job. A small blessing. My watch said we had about an hour of usable light left, maybe less under the cloud cover. I pulled out my emergency tarp, the fabric slick and cold in my hands, and we both knew what had to be done. If we didn't find better shelter before nightfall, hypothermia could become our next problem. The ridge was no place to spend a night, not with the wind cutting the way it did. We climbed out of the crevice cautiously, half expecting another flash to split the sky. The forest was steaming, mist rising between the trees, the air thick and ghostly. Our boots squished in mud, and the moss gleamed under the fading light. Somewhere below, I heard the faint trickle of water. "Stream," Ryan said, his voice hoarse. "Maybe a good spot to camp nearby." We followed the sound, weaving through broken branches and slick roots until we reached a small runoff creek tumbling between granite slabs. We both knelt to drink, hands cupped to the cold water. It tasted like metal and rain and earth, pure and grounding. My body trembled, but I felt a little of the fear wash away with that drink. The mountains have a way of humbling you quick. One moment you're invincible, and the next you're praying for a flat patch of ground. A few hundred yards downstream, we found a small shelf beneath an overhanging rock. It wasn't much, but the slope above would keep most of the runoff away. We cleared debris, shaking from the cold, then rigged the tarp at an angle using what rope and stakes we had left. Ryan worked in silence, his jaw set, his movements efficient. The last light of day caught in the wet folds of his jacket, turning it to dull silver. When we finally crawled underneath the tarp, the storm was a distant growl, the clouds thinning to reveal a smear of fading orange beyond the ridge. I fired up the tiny stove, just enough to heat water for some instant soup. The hiss of the burner felt like music after all that thunder. We sat close, knees drawn up, trading sips from the metal cup. The soup was bland and lukewarm, but it felt like a feast. Steam drifted between us, curling into the night air. I remember watching Ryan's face in the dim light, tired, dirty, but calm now. Neither of us spoke for a while. There was nothing left to say. When the wind picked up again, I tucked my jacket tighter and listened. It wasn't the angry howl from before, just the mountain breathing settling after the rage. And there, in that little pocket of calm, I realised how thin the line was between disaster and survival. We were still wet, still cold, but we'd made it through. For now, that was enough. The night settled over us like a slow tide. The last glow of sunset drained from the sky, leaving only the faint shimmer of mist rising from the forest below. The temperature dropped fast, faster than I expected, and our breath turned to smoke in the dim light of the headlamp. Ryan and I huddled close under the tarp, listening to the steady drip of rainwater from the rock above. Every sound felt amplified, the trickle of the nearby stream, the creak of tree limbs heavy with moisture, the occasional distant rumble of thunder still prowling somewhere east. I pulled my damp sleeping bag from its compression sack and shook it out. It was far from dry, but better than nothing. We crawled inside our bags, wearing every layer we had. The cold wasn't cruel, not yet. It was just a creeping, quiet thing that worked its way in through wet socks and stiff fingers. My mind wouldn't settle, though. Every flash of distant lightning lit up the inside of my eyelids, like a memory I couldn't shake. The ridge glowing white, Ryan slipping, the world split by noise. It replayed again and again, and each time I felt that same tightness in my chest. Think it's past for good? Ryan's voice was low, barely louder than the rain. I think so, I said, but we'll know by midnight. He gave a quiet laugh. I've never felt smaller in my life. I smiled in the dark. That's the mountains for you. They remind you what you really are. For a long while, we just listened. The mountain, even in its silence, had its own kind of music. The gurgle of water over stone, the sighing of wind through the spruces, the heartbeat rhythm of dripping rain. It was oddly soothing, and I felt the tension in my muscles start to ease. Sometime around midnight, I woke to the sound of branches cracking nearby. My hand went instinctively to the knife by my side, though I knew it wouldn't help much against whatever might be out there. The forest was dark and breathing, mist curling low to the ground, faint light reflecting off wet bark. I held my breath, listening. Another crack. Closer this time. Ryan stirred beside me, whispering, "Elk?" I hoped he was right. The movement stopped after a while, replaced again by the endless dripping of rain. Whatever it was, it had moved on. Sleep came in fits after that. The cold worked its way through every layer, and when I did drift off, I dreamed of lightning, the sharp smell, the blinding light, the way it seemed to freeze time. But then, just before dawn, I woke to something new. Silence. Real silence. The kind that makes your ears ring after a storm has finally burned itself out. I crawled halfway out from under the tarp, and the world had changed. The clouds were breaking apart in streaks of silver and rose, and mist pooled like smoke in the valleys below. Everything glistened. Wet pine needles, black stone, the sheen of water over moss. Ryan stirred awake behind me, blinking at the pale light. We didn't speak at first. We just sat there, letting the morning seep in, feeling the warmth of a world reborn after chaos. It was hard to believe that only hours earlier we'd been clinging to that ridge, convinced we might not make it. Now, all that remained was the quiet aftermath, the mountain calm, indifferent and eternal. When the first true light of morning broke over the ridge, it was like the world was giving us permission to breathe again. The peaks to the west were capped in clouds, their edges rimmed with gold from the rising sun. Everything below was still wet and shining, every leaf and blade of grass jewelled with droplets that caught the light. I crawled out from under the tarp and stretched, feeling the stiffness in my shoulders and back, from a night spent curled up on uneven ground. My boots were cold, still damp, but they'd held together. Ryan emerged a moment later, hair plastered to his forehead, his breath puffing in little white clouds. He looked at me and grinned, the kind of grin you give when you're just grateful to still be here. We built a small fire in a patch of gravel near the stream, using what little dry tinder we could find beneath the rock ledge. It took patience and a lot of stubbornness. But eventually, a wisp of smoke turned to a flicker, then to a flame that hissed softly as it licked the damp wood. The warmth spread slowly, the smell of pine smoke curling through the morning air. Steam rose from our clothes as we leaned close. Ryan handed me a tin mug, half full of coffee, lukewarm but glorious. I took a sip and let it warm my hands before saying a word. "I'll never forget that ridge," I said finally. "Yeah," Ryan answered, staring into the fire. "I kept thinking how easy it is to get caught out there. One bad call, one storm too late." I nodded. "The mountain doesn't care how careful you think you are." After breakfast, we packed up in silence. The tarp went into its bag, still damp, our gear muddy and scratched. The trail leading down from the hollow was slick, but stable, winding through a stand of fir trees that smelled rich and clean after the storm. The higher we climbed down, the warmer the air grew, and by mid-morning, the sun was bright enough to make the rocks steam. When we finally looked back, the ridge we'd fought across looked harmless, just another line of stone against the sky. It almost seemed to mock us with its stillness. As we hiked, I found myself thinking about that moment when the lightning struck close, how every sense had sharpened, how time had seemed to stretch. I'd never felt more alive or more fragile. There was a strange peace in that realization, like the mountain had stripped us down to something pure and honest. It didn't feel like fear anymore, it felt like respect. When we reached the tree line, the trail widened and the valley opened below us, green, calm, sunlit. The sound of water carried through the air and birds had returned to their songs as if nothing had happened. Ryan turned to me with that crooked grin again. "Next time," he said, "maybe we pick a nice flat forest trail. No ridges." "Sure," I laughed, tightening my pack straps. "Next time." But even as we walked on, part of me knew there'd always be another ridge calling, somewhere up there above the tree line where the air smells like rain and risk, and where every storm reminds you just how alive you are.